The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Nick Cortina. I'm excited to bring you another Exago lab today. Before we continue, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me all right, can see my screen. So please go ahead and type a Y or a yes in the questions pane. If you want to let me know if you're excited about the new Star Wars movie, that would also be sufficient. Just type in something. All right, perfect. It looks like everybody can hear me. So we are all set to get started. Once again, my name is Nick Cortina, and today we are excited to bring you this Exago support lab all about an interesting capability that we developed here on the services team called Share by Link. Now, before we really get into the meat of what we're talking about today, there's a few things that I want to be really upfront about so that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're actually seeing here. First and foremost, we're going to be looking at a lot of code today, and I know that that's something that not everybody's always comfortable with, so I just want to be really upfront that today's lab is primarily going to be in Visual Studio, taking a look at a lot of different code pieces. And the other thing I want to make sure I'm upfront about is we're going to have to move a little bit quickly. There's lots of different parts and pieces to this lab, and if we really go in depth on all of them, we might be here for a good hour and a half or so. So with that in mind, we are going to be jumping around a little bit. I'm going to make sure that we talk through the new components of sharing by link. But in terms of things that have already been developed and that we've already seen, I'm not going to be going over those too rigorously. And that kind of ties into the second bullet that we're seeing here. In terms of the core folder management extensibility components, which is a core component of this share by link example, I'm not going to be talking too much about those folder management pieces. So if you're not already familiar with the folder management extension that's available on our support site, I would encourage you to check out the pre-existing lab on folder management prior to actually watching what I'm about to show you today. So if that's not something you've seen, if I say folder management extension and you think, hey, what's that? I might encourage you to stop watching this webinar and go check out that example prior to coming back and watching this recording, which we'll again post on our support site after the lab. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that we're not going to be giving any copy-pastable examples with this lab. You're not going to find these examples in our support set anywhere. And furthermore, this isn't a production quality example either. What we're going to see, if it's something that you intend to try and leverage in your environment, it should be modified from the base examples you'll see here today. I'm going to try and include some notes as to things that I personally would want to see clients beef up before implementing something like this. But again, take everything with that grain of salt that prior to taking something that you see here and kind of moving forward with it, you should really be fully understanding it and modifying it and strengthening it before actually implementing anything. There's a couple other assumptions that I'm making in terms of viewers who are going to stick with us for the duration of this lab. Those assumptions are listed here. So I'm assuming that you have some programming experience with C#, JavaScript, and HTML, and that you're comfortable looking at some of those examples and again, moving through some of them a little bit more quickly. I'm also assuming that you've got familiarity with folder management and particularly action events. Like I indicated before, if that's not something you're familiar with, I might encourage you to check out that pre-recorded lab before continuing with us on this lab here today. The last thing, and I really just want to restate this, you are not expecting production quality sample code or any sample code from this lab for that matter. These aren't samples that we're posting anywhere on our support site. If this specific functionality is something that you see and you think, man, I need that now, I really want it, how do I get my hands on it? Feel free to submit a ticket to our services team and we can discuss that with you a little bit more. Now, with all of our disclaimers out of the way, how exactly are we going to do this? Well, as those of you who have seen folder management might be aware, we have an ability to modify the way that we interact with the right-click menu on reports. And we're going to see in just a second that we're actually going to add a new option to that right-click menu so that we can leverage this share by link feature. It's going to effectively use some client-side code to pass the relevant information about that report to the server-side code, which will allow us to generate a specific link to that specific report. The last piece of this is that we actually have to modify how our host application is going to work so that it can receive this special link that we're going to generate and interpret that link to launch in a new Exago session that specifically executes that report that we chose to share. So at this point, let's just dive right in and take a look at how this thing is actually working. So to kick this off, I'm going to start by launching our host application, and we'll get back into Visual Studio in just a moment. And here we'll see that I've just got a simple application that's loading the full Exago UI into an iframe on my page here. Now, if I expand this My Reports folder, we can see I've got this report configured. And if I go ahead and open this report, we'll see it's just a simple report with a couple fields in a detail section. I've included my opinion about some of the Star Wars films up at the top here. If we run this report, fairly simple, nothing too complex. And in terms of the new functionality that we're seeing here today, if I click on my menu option for this report in my report tree, we'll notice that there's an additional menu item called Get Sharing Link here down below. When I select this Get Sharing Link, I've got this special link that's generated. As we mentioned before, this is going to contain specific information about this report. And I've got a little button here that will actually copy that to my clipboard. And now if I open a new tab and navigate directly to that URL, we'll see that we're going to launch a new Exago session, this time not with the full Exago UI. We're actually just going to execute that specific report again in an iframe on the screen. And this is the full execution of the report. We can tab through the pages. We've got our export options here, all the bells and whistles that we might have chosen to add to this given report. So how exactly does this work? What do we need to actually change about our folder management implementation as well as Exago to get this all configured and working properly? One of the first things that we need to do is actually modify the database schema for our folder management tables. And specifically, that's going to be the report access table. So I've just navigated to a database management tool here, and I just wanted to show that in this report access table, we've now got this can share column. And this is just a bit column. Effectively, it'll take a value of 1 or 0. And what this is going to do for us is allow us to dictate on a report access record basis whether or not that access record allows that entity, where, as you are familiar from folder management, an entity is either everyone, a class of user, a company of users, or a specific user, to share that given report item that that report access record is included for. Now, the other thing that we need to do is actually add a couple pieces to our Exago configuration in order to configure this properly as well. So if I navigate over to my admin console, we're going to see there's a couple parameters that I've added to my configuration that are going to make this work as well. The first of these is shared by link. This is a parameter that we're potentially going to leverage to effectively say, hey, is this report something that's being shared by a link, as opposed to, say, a normal instance of Exago where we're just executing a report in that iframe, executing a single report, I should say. The other parameters we've got here are the sharing base URL. This is effectively the base URL that we want to add what we're going to call an execution token. That's that information about that report I've been alluding to. We'll see how that's generated in just a moment. That information will get added to the end of this base URL. So this is effectively a way for us to say, what is the specific host application URL that we need to use that we can add report information to the end of, such that when we navigate to it, the host application is configured to say, let's interpret that report information and execute that specific report. The final parameter that we're including here that's new is going to be this show sharing parameter. And this one is fairly intuitive in terms of the name. If this is set to true for a given session, that's what's going to enable that get sharing link option in the right-click menu. If this is set to false, we would not see that option in that menu. And as you folks are well aware, these parameters can be set via the API prior to launching a session. So if this was something you implemented and you wanted certain users to have this capability, but other users not to, toggling this parameter via an API call is what would give you the ability to do that. Now, there's a couple action events that we're going to have added here as well. Now, Again, from folder management, we should be familiar with this on-tree node right-click, set right-click menu event. This is what's modifying those right-click options in the report tree menu when I click that little menu option in the report tree. Now, this implementation is going to be almost the same as what you see in base folder management. There's a couple pieces we've added there, and again, we'll jump into Visual Studio in a second to see explicitly what those are. But in addition to that, we've actually added a second action event, and this is called Share by Link Open Dialog. We'll see this also comes from the action events assembly. So again, it's a new piece that's been added to folder management. But an interesting thing that you may notice is that this does not have an associated event type or global event type. What that actually does is it allows us to use this as a callback method, as opposed to defining it as an action event the way that we would with, say, the right-click option here. So we'll see that in just a moment. This method here is actually going to be assigned as a callback method for that new menu item that we add to the right-click menu. Now, we touched on some of the pieces as we've added them to the admin console, but now we're going to jump into Visual Studio so we can see what some of these methods are actually doing and how we've changed this right-click menu to add that new option. So at this point, I'm going to jump over to my extensibility solution. So here, we're first going to start with the action events class. And again, this is something you've very well seen if you've implemented that folder management extension. The first thing we'll take a look at is this on tree node right-click action event, because this is really where everything's going to start. Now, in a normal folder management implementation, you'll effectively see this collection of lines here. You'll notice that for this specific implementation, we just added a couple pieces. The first being parsing this show sharing parameter value into a Boolean. And this is effectively what's going to dictate whether or not we get to show that sharing component. You'll see now that for the set right-click menu script, we're now going to pass in an input parameter, and that's going to dictate whether or not we show that additional sharing option. So at this point, in terms of loading the JavaScript code and setting that call to the set right-click menu, this is really just going and getting a JavaScript file and passing some information in so we can use that code on the client side. Again, this is part of the core folder management component, so I'm not going to go into too much depth into how this piece works. But at this point, I do want to go take a look at that actual JavaScript so we can see how that component has been modified in comparison to a base folder management implementation. So to kick things off, this is that set right-click menu JavaScript function. We can see that now it takes an input parameter called show sharing. Really, everything that we're going to see up here is fairly similar to what you've already seen in a folder management implementation. Right down here is where we start getting into the new meat of how this show sharing component is going to work. So if that Boolean value is set to true, we're going to add a separator. That's that little line that dictates there's a new section of the menu. And we're going to add a new item to that new section of the menu. And this is going to be the share item. And we're also going to store some new language elements that effectively say get sharing link. And that's what this client info.get language data is doing. You'll see this example in various other places in folder management as well. You'll also notice that we store another image in our application theme, so that way we can have that custom sharing image on that new menu item that we create. Now, the other interesting thing here is that you might have show sharing enabled for a user to say that user can share given items, but there might be specific reports that you don't want any user sharing regardless of whether or not they can share different report items. And that's where that can share value in the database is going to come into play. So in this case, when we parse the report UDF information, if we find that the can share property for that given report item is set to false, then we're going to call this enable item method, which will actually disable an item if it's already been enabled. And if that's actually not a report, meaning it's a folder, we're going to get a special tooltip that says you can't share that folder. If it does happen to be a report, we're going to get another tooltip that says you can't share that report. So again, this chunk of code here is how we handle instances where you've chosen to show sharing to a user, but they click on a report or a folder that they're not supposed to be able to share. And again, that not supposed to be able to share is going to be dictated by that can share property that we saw in the database report access table. So we've added this new share component to the menu. We'll notice that down here in the set on click, we've actually got a special case for that new share component. And this is where we add that client info server callback to what we call a share by link open dialog method. As we recall, this was the name of that action event we added to Exago's configuration. So this name has to match the name that we assigned to that action event in the Exago admin console. And that's why we didn't need to add the event type or the global event type, because this server callback is going to call that method as opposed to being triggered by some other Exago action. We'll also notice that we're going to pass back our node data to that method, where that node data is going to be all the information we see on line 64 here. So that'll be the report name, the report type enum, the full path, whether or not it's a report or a folder, and the report UDF, which is some other generic information about the report. The final thing that we've modified here is that if that show sharing is set to true, when we actually close that menu, we're going to remove the sharing item just to clean up that menu. If we don't have something like this included, every time we add that menu item, it'll compound and keep getting added, and we'd actually see multiple get sharing link options depending on the number of times we click. So having this relationship between what happens when we click and what happens when we close, where we add that component, associate the server callback, and then when we close, remove that item again, is what helps us keep that menu only showing that one option, no matter how many times we've selected it. So at this point, the user has selected that menu item, they see that new option, and once they click it, we're performing this server callback to share by link open dialog, and we're passing back in this node data. So let's take a closer look at this share by link open dialog method. Back in our action events class, as we recall in the admin console, that's where we're pulling that method from. That's going to be this share by link open dialog method here. We'll see that this is configured to, again, take session info. That's going to be consistent amongst almost all the server side programming that we're doing here. And it's taking that node JSON back as well. And here, very simply, we're going to assign some JavaScript code to be the JavaScript action. And in order to do that, we're actually going to use another helper method called open dialog. And that's going to come from this sharing by link class. And so to this method, we're passing in the session info, our current JavaScript action, as well as the node JSON. So we'll jump over to the sharing by link class. And here we can see that open dialog method. So the first thing we're going to do is get some generic parameters from the session and just store them as local strings. We're going to deserialize that node JSON as node data. And this is something that we've seen in the folder management extension. The node data is effectively just some information about the report. From here, we're going to create what's called an execution tokens class. And this is going to take all that generic information about the report. If I scroll down here for just a moment, we'll see the definition of that class. The other interesting thing we're doing here is we're going to override the toString to actually serialize that object as JSON. And that'll make it easier for us to take all this information about the report and include it in a URL. So that way, when the host application receives that URL, it can interpret that execution token, which we're actually just going to include as a URL parameter. Now, the next thing we're doing after we create that execution token, which again is holding all the report information that the host app will need in order to execute that specific report, is we're going to encrypt that string. And we're going to do so just using a base encryption example. I'm not going to go too in-depth on this component because I don't really think that's the purpose of this lab. This is just a simple version of encryption that we're using for the purpose of the example. One of the things that I would absolutely recommend modifying before taking this and trying to implement it in a production environment is this encryption example, because this is really just one of the simplest examples I could find that we could use here. We'd likely want to use something a little bit more off the beaten path and a little bit stronger than what we see here. Now, once we've created the encrypted execution token here, what we're going to do is construct the URL string, which is going to have that sharing base URL from that parameter value that we saw. And we're going to append the question mark execution token equals. That's what's saying, hey, the next component of the URL is this URL parameter. And we'll add the encrypted execution token there. At that point, we're going to make a couple additional calls here. So first, we're going to go load this JavaScript code to grab the share by link dialog template. That's going to be the actual HTML that we saw that displays that little dialog box that's got the URL link in it, as well as that copy to clipboard button. And we're also going to load up this JavaScript code, show share by link dialog, which is going to help us in terms of adding the on-click event to that copy link to clipboard button, as well as pushing the URL into that little input text box. So let's take a quick look at the HTML. We can see here there's nothing too crazy going on. We've just got a simple dialog box that's going to contain a text box with an ID of URL text box. And then we've also just got a specific button that's called copy to clipboard button. Now, the other thing that we're doing is we're using that show share by link dialog JavaScript function. And so here we can see that effectively what we're doing is just setting some information about the HTML dialog. We're populating the share by link dialog title here, and again, that's going to be set from our language files. Now, the next thing we're going to do is go get that text box that we included, the URL text box, and we're going to populate it with our URL string that we've created, and that's getting passed in from the server-side code. The other thing we're doing is going to set the attribute to read only, because once we construct that URL, we don't want the user to be going in and modifying that information, because then when they navigate to it, they might not get to the correct report that we're trying to actually share. The next thing we're doing is we're getting that copy button, and we're going to set some styling on the background. So we'll see that I've actually just chosen to get the duplicate report hover, which is actually one of the base images included in Exago application themes. And I chose this icon just because it looks similar to a copy icon, but you could certainly include a new image if you wanted and use that for the copy icon, or even do something else entirely. Again, that part's really up to you. And then the next important thing we do is we assign an on-click function to that button that's going to copy the contents of the URL text box to the clipboard for us, and then close the dialog. Now, once we've got that URL copied, we'll actually go and navigate to it, and that's where the host application is going to come into play. So if I navigate it back over to our host application, we can see here that once that page goes to load, it's first going to generate a new API instance. And then we're actually going to go try and grab the execution token from the URL. And if we grab that execution token and it doesn't happen to exist, we'll see that we'll kind of skip this whole if block, which we're going to jump into in just a second. And we'll effectively launch a base API session, and the default API action is to launch the home page. So by not setting that property, we're saying, hey, we're just going to show the full Exago UI. We make this call to get URL param string, which is effectively always going to be one of the last steps before we can construct that full URL, which is the Exago HTTP name. This is effectively just the base URL of the Exago web page that's set in our web config of this application. And we're going to add the specific param string, which is actually coming from that API instance. Again, this is just base Exago integration information. And this constructs that full Exago URL and pushes it into our iframe. Now, if that execution token is there and is part of the URL, that means that what we can do is go and try and decrypt that string. And if we take a look at that decryption method, it's basically going to mirror the encryption method that we took a quick look at. Again, I'm not going to go too in depth on this component, but just know that this is probably part of what you'd want to include in this example if this is something you were going to leverage. Once we decrypt that information, we'll go and we'll actually grab the execution tokens by deserializing that execution token string. The next thing we're going to do is go set up some API parameters for this session. And we've got this helper method called setAPIParameter. I'm going to take a quick peek at the definition, and effectively all this helper method is doing is it's going to assign the value of parameters if they exist already in the admin console. But if they don't already exist, if we go and try and get them and they come back as null, we're going to add those to our collection instead. So we're going to assign the values of the parameters that we can see here. And one important note is that in this instance, we're actually using some new API parameters called shared user ID, shared company key ID, and shared class ID. And these are going to effectively allow us to execute this report with that new user who's receiving this share by link URL. They're going to be allowed to execute this report as if they were the user who sent the link. And that's because in the execution token that we pass along, the values for the user ID and company ID and class ID are those of the user who created the link, not of the user that's consuming it. So something that you might want to consider, and again, this is another one of those, you may want to change the way that this works before potentially implementing something like this, is you may say, well, you know what, if a user shares a report by link, the user who's consuming that link should really see the report with their relevant data values, and we should assign the parameters in that way to reflect that. So if that's something that you're interested in, you might not want to leverage these shared user ID, shared company key ID, and shared class ID parameters. In this case, it's all the same. They're all coming from that execution token. So we are considering the case where when a user shares a report, they want the viewer of that report to see the same set of data and same permission level that they saw when they executed it. From here, we're going to go grab the full report name and we're going to parse that from our execution token. We're going to set the API action to execute a report. That means we're just going to execute this specific report in this session. We'll set our show tabs to false, and this is basically just disabling the tabular interface, so we're not allowed to go anywhere else in Exago. And then we're loading up that report object by calling load from repository, setting the export type to HTML, and saving that to our API instance we created. Once we leave this if block, everything else is going to be the same in terms of launching and consuming that session. So we're getting the URL param string for that session, post all of the changes we just made. We're setting that content to be the source of our iframe, and then the page will continue loading, consume the Exago session, and display that single report execution in the iframe. And that's really it in terms of this example. I think we'll pause and hang around for just a little bit to see if anybody does have any other questions. The other thing I do want to mention here is that our next lab is going to be coming up on November 6th. That's going to be continuing our Train the Trainer series, and we're going to be talking about advanced reports. So be sure to tune in there. Again, as I mentioned, we'll stick around just a little bit to see if anyone else does have any other questions. And on that note, happy reporting. And after the lab, you should all be getting a survey where you can leave feedback for the lab, as well as include ideas for other lab topics. If you are interested in seeing anything in particular, please leave feedback, as we're definitely running out of ideas, and we'd love to know what you folks are more interested in seeing. So definitely leave us your feedback, because we'd love to hear it.